Hey everyone, welcome into yet another fantastic new episode of The Cloud is Calling. And I am incredibly excited to be joined by my colleague and good friend Alex Bianchi, who also happens to be a fellow practice director here at Trace 3, but he works over in the management consulting world. Now, I think as most everyone hopefully knows, Cloud's been around for, well, at least a decade, if not longer. So we're dating ourselves just a tiny bit. But it still seems like a lot of organizations struggle to have sound strategies as it comes to the use of cloud. It's been a decade. Why do you think that's still the case with the cloud platforms?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a few things, right? I think first off, right, like you just mentioned, right? It's been around for a decade. And if you ask people what actually they thought they could do in the cloud like 5 years ago, let alone 2 years ago, let alone even last year, I think the ball keeps on moving, right? You look at look at this week, right, at re:Invent and what's going on and the things that come out every year, right? And you see a maturation, evolution, and the ability and the capabilities of the platforms and the hyperscalers to really kind of enable true now like IaaS and PaaS type kind of environments for clients. I think that that endpoint and that goal really starts shifting. And so I think, the one, there's a constant reevaluation, right, that needs to occur at that strategy level. And then two, I think, tying into it, like I think a lot of organizations don't think about it in that way. They don't think about it as an ongoing transformation, right? I think not necessarily a one and done, but I think yeah, we hear a lot of terminology around lift and ship and these very kind of contained right focus areas for a cloud program. But I think that a lot of organizations struggle with really thinking about it as an ongoing evolution and an adaptation throughout that evolution to continuously take advantage of the new capabilities, the new platforms that are out there, and integrate those into both their processes and their technology environments. So it's a complex and it's a constantly changing environment, right?
Do you think it's more of an issue of enterprises versus, say, small and medium-sized businesses haven't quite come around to the methodologies that we see more common? I'm talking more about DevOps style methodologies where it's that continuous evolution, continuous reevaluation of, okay, here's where the original goals of my project I set out to do, we've reached X point, let's reevaluate, let's kind of get feedback. Have we achieved what we set out to do? Do we need to kind of readjust and move some of those sprints to a different area? Is it, are you seeing more of that kind of struggle, or is it just, hey, the hyperscalers are innovating so quickly, no one can keep up? And so it's just that goalpost just keeps sailing further and further away from them.
Um, I think it's a little bit of both. I think I'd say probably the previous, where I think there is,
Mhm.
like I said, as I think about it as a transformation, right? And I mean, we talk a lot with clients around the mentality shift to truly something as kind of truly kind of revolutionary as like IAC, right? And some of the concepts of like truly orchestrating and moving to a completely virtualized like IT infrastructure environment, right? That's not just a set of tools, right? That's an entire, like I said, kind of philosophy around how do we as an organization change. For enterprise organization, that's obviously a massive shift that impacts, across, probably almost every single silo of the organization. And that's how we think about strategy, right? Is really starting with a very kind of comprehensive spectrum of impacts. Um, but I think, like I said, I think like each size organization struggle with that, right? It's a little bit easier, I think, for some of the large organizations to like really wrap their heads around and also devote the necessary resources to something like DevOps, which is, in its own right, is a hugely transformational kind of objective. Whereas, yeah, the smaller, mid-sized maybe firms struggle with a little bit for like how to right size it. I think is kind of their challenge, right? Is how do I not kind of overdo it? How do I not spend $10 million just kind of like dipping my toes into the DevOps waters, right? Or ocean, maybe is maybe the better term. So,
Yeah.
but
Um, so, I mean, thinking about the struggles most enterprises face, most other organizations face, how can they set themselves up for success as it relates to cloud adoption and cloud integration, right? You've talked about not it just being
good.
this single transformational project, really just kind of this ongoing effort, right? I guess to use a real world parody, what's made Capital One so successful, right? They've adopted AWS. Nobody's that's not a unknown thing, right? And they've been very
Yeah.
successful at it. And others of their same size struggle. So, kind of what do they need to do to really set themselves up for that type of success?
I think two things that we've really tried to integrate into like our approaches to strategy to help our clients, no matter the size or the landscape or where they're at in that journey, is one is really tying it back to the business objectives, right? Like, I mean, we always love to say that IT should be enabling, right, of business outcomes, but it's we get so there's so much complexity underneath the waters there that we get into about the tool sets, the technology, and the teams and everything else that it's a constant reminder to try to go back to that and say, hey, like that's really a question of like, why are we doing this, right? What's the business outcome that we are driving, right? And how do we focus ourselves appropriately on that? And so I think one, it's about setting those right KPIs, OKRs, whatever it is, right, that are aligned to the business. So number one, and then number two, something that's maybe the last few years is a bit more kind of a buzzword or whatever. I think, but it's true is a more product mindset, right, around IT, right, around once you have those OKRs, a lot more we're talking about is providing services to development groups or different business lines or however it may work, but taking in some of that. You don't have to kind of move completely to a product management kind of mentality or safe or whatever you want to do. But like, I think having that mindset, just a little bit of what are the right OKRs, and then how do we think about those as, like I said, as products, right? As things that we're developing. We can go through MVP phases. We can really get things out there. We're interacting with the people that are consuming those, internal, external, right, to get that constant kind of feedback to help us kind of chart the right waters. I think those two things, like I said, no matter the size or the scope, are always going to help you really kind of tailor the right strategy and keep focus where it should be.
Yeah.
Right.
So what sort of investments do you think organizations need to make in those areas, right? You're talking about those kind of key things. If I'm, CEO of Derek Corp here, right? What sort of investments would I need to make into my business or my different areas to kind of address some of those challenges you just highlighted?
I think when we talk a lot with our clients about kind of whatever we're going to call it, the cloud center of excellence, kind of
Mhm.
champions, whatever. There's got to be a strong locus, right, of ownership and talent and knowledge, right, who are um, challenged with those OKRs and those KPIs, right? Who are going to take some of that ownership and help drive it, right? And so I think that's a big investment of time and thought and leadership, right? For organizations that we see these days, and especially the last few years, are just struggling to find time just to hop on a 30-minute phone call, right? I mean, so when you talk about investments, it's like, yeah, there's tons of tools, there's tons of things out there that are great in the right situation. But I think the hardest investment to make is the time and the thought leadership, right? And to devote that. And like I said, going back to my earlier point, not just at a point in time, but as a continuous investment, right? That's gonna pay dividends as you really grow and evolve. And I think that's probably the hardest. I think the other, maybe the one that comes up a lot we talk about, and I think we love to talk about it, but it's very hard to execute on. It is actually the training and the skills
Mhm.
development and the investments in that. There's tons of amazing things. We were just talking about LinkedIn kind of courses, and you're going to have experience
Yep.
with that. Like other places, there's just a plethora of great sources to expose your teams to and stuff. We've seen a lot of organizations over the last kind of few years that have gotten really better about skills and talents assessment and development programs. But there's a lot that can be done in that space, and there's just so much that can really help an organization. I think really kind of um, jet power their evolution and their usage of cloud just by helping their team actually go and take advantage of some of those things.
Are are there any sort of like frameworks or guides, so to speak, that organizations should be looking at when they're considering this transformational cloud strategy, right? Is there a blueprint, so to speak, right? There's a blueprint for my house. Is there a blueprint for something like this?
I mean, there's a lot more on the architectural side. Obviously, you have
Yeah.
like well-architected framework and some of the great like, and then from the security processes from NIST, CSA, CCM, et cetera, right, that are going to provide kind of those better frameworks. from an organizational perspective, there's so much uniqueness, I think, to the organizational dynamics and also kind of the business structure and lines of the organization. It's hard to say yes. Like I think there's common components, like we spoke about, like a CCOE kind of champions, like bringing those together. I think there's common kind of guiding principles about being, cross-functional and inclusive from the start of bringing in business. We do cloud strategies, we get challenged up front because we're like, we want to bring in the business, we want to bring in your key users to these conversations, and they're like, well, why do you want to do that? Like we don't even know what strategy we're doing yet. We're like, yeah, we want to bring them along, right? We want to build
Yeah.
buy-in with those teams. We want to build momentum with them, and we want to kind of keep them engaged and interested in what you're doing. So it's got to be inclusive. So the long and the short answer is I don't think there are great kind of frameworks like something that you can just kind of read out for the organizational side. But I do think, like I said, combining those with a lot of the maturity and the technical side has just come a long way, as like in the past few years, in terms of having the well-architected framework just as a great example of something that can really be a solid benchmark for a lot of organizations. um, I think lowers the bar significantly in terms of trying to kind of get to a stability or a point of maturity in cloud.
Now, because organizations are so dynamic, right? Their internal politics are, you know, depending on who you're working with. Based on your experience and interacting with different clients, do you feel that organizations are more successful if they have a more centralized approach to adopting this, or do you feel like there are advantages to being more decentralized? Because obviously, I've seen different customers be in both right, both ways, right? You have large organizations that have multiple subsidiaries, so they're a little more decentralized, and you have other ones who are like, nope, everybody abides by this period. Like, where do you feel is
Yeah,
kind of the better path?
I feel like actually we're finding there's an interesting kind of, I think, common thread in a lot of our kind of recent discussions around kind of more what I call kind of like federated models, right? We're
Mhm.
kind of maybe a little bit of a path in between. There's got to be centralized governance at some point over your like architecture, your security, and some of these kind of critical components, right? But tying back to like thoughts around, like I said, product management, like Dallas, like you're talking about earlier, like you also one of the great parts about the cloud we're talking about is this culture of agility, right? Like you want to allow exploration, innovation, etc. So like if you centralize too much, like you're losing some of that. So there's this balance point of like, yes, for each organization, let's think about there are common components that we need to kind of govern, right? How do we kind of get those in place, but then allow right flexibility underneath of that, and then put some policy structures or even just kind of like working committees or something in place, right, that can allow for communication and sharing of kind of those types of benefits. And so you know, I'd say, like I said, I think like yeah, starting out organizations, we tell them quite frankly, you need to probably start out in a more centralized fashion, just because we've seen a lot of people go off the rails in the last 10 years, and you see like, the financial governance
Mhm.
is if not the hot topic, is the number one or two on everybody's mind. And so in order to maintain something, yes, you got to start out and you've got to put some guardrails up and some maturity around it. But then I think it's about finding that balance of how do you allow those teams who are leveraging some of the cloud-based services and native kind of devices and capabilities to really kind of you know build their own path a little bit.
Yeah. No, that sounds good. I like the more balanced approach, right? There's not
It's a
one,
it's a it's a great it's depends answer, right? But like
well,
it's
it
true.
depends
It's true
answer,
these
but I
days.
think ultimately, to your point, right, you need somebody to at least kind of say, "Hey, here are the guardrails, here are some of the boundaries, but we're gonna allow you to play in those boundaries."
I think it's
Keep
a great thought
keep
of being how to be great referees for your organization, right? Like it's an interesting concept, right? It's like
Yeah.
it's like you don't want to be the guy that like everybody's throwing the beer at the TV at, right? Like
Exactly. Yeah,
so,
yeah. You don't want to be
so
the guy
yeah,
that's
it's
throwing the
like
flag on every play, right? You're going to be hated, but you also
yeah,
don't want to be the guy
exactly.
who never pulls out the flag and just lets everyone just run amok and do whatever.
Yeah,
So
no, it's a hard balance, and like once
it
again, I don't know
is.
if there's a great playbook for that, but it's like, but like I said, we found that like I said, talking about these things, bringing them into light, and like leaning into those challenges and those questions, and kind of bringing people to the table for those is a great guiding principle to like help you set you on the right path there.
Yeah. New required reading for IT people. Ed Hockley's. experience as an NFL referee.
Yeah, exactly. So
All right, Alex, appreciate you being on. Any final thoughts? Anything you want to add around, what organizations are should be thinking about as it relates to cloud strategies? Just nuggets of information that you've come across over the past couple of years you've been doing this.
no, we touched on them. I think, like I said, every time we go through this, the high points, keeping the focus on business value, right, and really how you can do that. I think the more organizations learn, and just we as an industry learn about the best ways to leverage cloud, which still is going on. I think it's just continue learning, right? Continue to have an appetite for evolving and leaning into those challenges. So
Alex, appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in. And remember, the cloud is calling.